Hello, thank you very much everyone for joining us today for the panel. Welcome to today's session, which is entitled Beyond Borders, Advocating for Refugee, Asylum Seeker, and Immigration Rights. My name is Kristen Euler-McKeown. I'm the Vice President of Fellowships at Equal Justice Works, and we are really thrilled that you're all here today to join us and hear from our panel. Thank you again, panelists, for being here. Before we get started, if you'd like to enable closed captioning on your screen, please click closed captioning at the bottom of your screen. If you have any questions or comments for our panelists during this session, I'll be monitoring the chat box on Pathable. And so please just type your comments in there and our panelists will answer those questions towards the end of our session. This session runs 3:30 to 4:30 Eastern time. And if you have to leave at any time during the session, feel free to do so. You can always rejoin by clicking on the name of the session under the event agenda. This session is being recorded, so in the event you're unable to join, you'll be able to listen to it later, so we can include all folks who may be unable to attend to listen to our recordings at another time. It will not be used for any other purposes. So without further ado, I'm going to turn it over to our moderator today, Yael Ben-Tov. Yael is with the International Refugee Assistance Project and is a current Equal Justice Works Fellow. Thank you very much. I'll take it over to you.
Thanks, Kristen. I guess we'll start with some introductions. Like she said, I am a current Equal Justice Works Fellow in my second year at the International Refugee Assistance Project, or IRAP, in the litigation department. So that's a bit about me, and I'm going to kick it to the rest of our panelists to introduce themselves. Stephanie, you want to go next?
Sure, thanks, Yael. So my name is Stephanie G. I am a supervising attorney at IRAP. I work in the legal services department at IRAP. So I work with Yael, but in a different department. And just by way of background, IRAP is a refugee rights organization that has 3 programmatic departments in pursuit of our mission, which is to develop and enforce a set of legal and human rights for refugees and displaced people around the world. So we do have a strategic litigation department where Yael works. We have a policy advocacy department that is focused on strategic policy and moving things at a legislative and policy level. And then we have a department that provides direct legal aid to individual clients. And that's the department that I work in. So my role is focused on providing direct legal assistance to refugees who are navigating complex immigration procedures in order to get to a place of permanent safety. And our work in my team is primarily focused on the United States, but we do also work with individuals who are navigating refugee resettlement and other immigration processes and humanitarian pathways to get to safety around the world.
Thanks, Stephanie. Robyn, do you want to go next?
Sure, thanks, Yael, and nice to be here with everyone. I'm Robyn Barnard, Senior Advocacy Counsel for Human Rights First in our Refugee Protection team. So Human Rights First is a nonprofit advocacy and representation organization. We've existed for more than 4 decades. Our work spans both refugee representation, which is largely focused on providing pro bono assistance and representation to people seeking asylum here in the United States, as well as those who are forced to wait outside of the country due to current policies of the US government. But we also are engaged in responding to the crisis in Afghanistan and trying to secure legal assistance to the many Afghans who are seeking to leave Afghanistan or to get to the United States from third countries as well. And then we have our advocacy wing where I work now. I was previously in our representation team where we advocate for policies that would protect asylum seekers and refugees. And outside of our refugee work, we do some work on foreign policy and extremism and human rights, and have done work in veterans work and human rights as well. So our main focus is how to hold the US government accountable to principles of human rights generally. And I guess I'll leave it there. Pass to Anusha.
Thank you so much. Hello, everyone. My name is Anusha S. I am the managing attorney for the regional team of the Tahrir Justice Center, which comprises of the DMV area, which is DC, Maryland, Virginia, with 2 office locations, one in Baltimore and one in Falls Church. The Tahrir Justice Center is a nationwide organization that has 5 different locations, and the mission of it is to represent courageous individual survivors of gender-based violence. We started as an organization that primarily focused on women and girls, but as you probably can anticipate, that has morphed and changed. And so we mostly see individuals that identify as women and girls, but is not limited just to that demographic. We are also providing holistic services, which expand in the legal field, social services field, and policy. And I'm very excited to be here to hopefully engage in a dynamic conversation.
Thank you so much for those introductions. Just to sort of elaborate a little bit on myself, I, like I said, work in the litigation department at IRAP, and what that means is that we bring strategic impact litigation. My Equal Justice Works project is focused on addressing delays in family reunification petitions for refugees and asylees, which have been egregious, and I do that through litigation, direct services, and policy work. So I think that, I'm a relatively recent grad. I graduated in 2020. And I think that one thing that's helpful to start with is to at least give some context for people who are attending this on sort of what we mean when we're talking about the refugee and asylum process. So maybe let's start with, say, like a basic overview, which is that refugees and asylees are like categorically the same thing, except the process for actually being admitted to the United States is different. So I'm gonna, so Stephanie, can you talk a little bit about what the refugee system is?
Sure. Yeah, so the refugee resettlement process and system to the United States is called the U.S. Refugee Admissions Program. It's often called USRAP because the government loves acronyms. And basically the way the system works is that every year the presidential administration sets a ceiling for the most number of refugees that can be admitted under this program per year, and then a whole bunch of programmatic details about how that happens. And then basically the process is refugees overseas who have access to this program or who are selected, for example, by the UN Refugee Agency to go through this program, are then processed from outside. And so they have to go through background checks, extensive interviews, medical exams. All of that happens while they wait wherever they're currently located. When they are cleared, they are granted refugee status on arrival to the United States. So they come into the US as refugees. That's their status when they arrive. They've already been determined to be refugees overseas. It's an overseas processing system. It is plagued with serious delays. It is also obviously subject to a lot of political considerations. And so, the biggest thing that impacted the US Refugee Admissions Program was obviously when the Trump administration came in and decided that they wanted to essentially decimate it, significantly lower the number of people allowed, tried to ban a whole bunch of nationalities from being allowed under this program. And while that was subject to a lot of litigation, at the end of the day, because it's an overseas humanitarian program, refugees do not have the same legal rights that they would if they were actually in the US when they started undergoing this procedure as asylum seekers. And so there's a process difference as well as sort of a rights difference between these categories of people, even though by definition, what they've experienced, what they've fled might look very similar. And so that and IRAP does a lot of work in the refugee resettlement system. And so we work a lot with those populations, whereas I think Anusha and Robyn can talk more about what it looks like from the asylum perspective.
Of course, I was on mute. I would actually add, at least emphasize one thing that Stephanie said, which is the Refugee Cap. The administration, the president issues every year what's called like a presidential determination that sets the number of refugees, that like the maximum number of refugees that can be admitted. That does not mean that we reach the maximum number of refugees that can be admitted. The PD for this year is, I think, 125,000, but we're nowhere near on track to actually meet that. I think we're still very, very low. So that also affects people's ability to come to the United States as refugees. Maybe Anusha or Robyn, whichever one of you wants to go first, can you tell us a little bit about how the asylum process is different?
Would you like to go first, Robyn?
You go for it, Anusha.
Are you sure? Okay. Look at that. Look at us fighting for sharing the asylum process. So the asylum process, basically, we're already in the United States. So with the refugee process, you're looking at someone who is outside the United States. With the asylum process, you already are here. How you have arrived in the United States may matter legally, but all of our clients may have a different starting point. And so for the purposes of the asylum process, there are very specific grounds that one can argue, must argue, as well as very specific timeframes. And so there are two types of asylum that you usually hear. One is the affirmative type and one is the defensive type. As you can probably guess from the name, affirmative, it's not within the context of a litigious and adversarial framework. So you are actually filing for your asylum claim through an agency, while in the defensive asylum, you are in an adversarial system, and it's most likely because as you were here in the United States, you were apprehended and had a connection with immigration, which then placed you in removal proceeding, and therefore you're now in court, federal court, immigration court specifically. And so the processes are very different. The expectations are very different. The standards are very different. In one, legal procedures don't really apply because it's an agency. In the other one, they're extremely strict. But at the end of the day, whether it's defensive or whether it is affirmative, the grounds for your claim are exactly the same. And you may have heard the famous 5 grounds of asylum. You have heard of nationality, probably political opinion, religion, even race. And then there's the catch-all, which is the belonging to a particular social group, which surprises a lot of individuals because gender is not a recognized ground for asylum. It's part of this catch-all, and that's why, depending on the administration, also asylum is filled with policy and politics. And so depending in what environment we may be, we see different outcomes, we see different behaviors, we see different adjudications even. But it's certainly, when it works, it's a pathway to then adjustment of status and eventually getting your citizenship.
Thanks for that. So Robyn, how does your work fit into all of this?
Yeah, I was going to just add a couple of things to it. Anusha just outlined about like the practicalities of seeking asylum in this country. I think one really important thing to note is that as it stands today, October 2021, there is no way for an asylum seeker to request asylum at our southern border. So many people who come to this country to seek protection may enter on a visa, like they come on a tourist visa or they come as a student. And while they're here, maybe their intention was to seek asylum or something changes back home, and then they are forced to then contemplate, okay, what do I do? I'm going to seek asylum. And they go through that affirmative process that was just described. But many others don't have access to get a visa, for example, to travel here and enter through an airport. And are forced to flee their country without a passport and without anything else, and make their way through very arduous journeys to get to our southern border to request protection. And under our laws, they have a legal right to do so, whether they go through an official port of entry or whether they cross the border and then seek asylum. But last year, the Trump administration used an existing health law called Title 42 to say that because of the COVID-19 pandemic, that asylum seekers were not allowed to exercise that legal right to seek protection any longer, and that the US government could use that law to expel them either back to their home country or back to Mexico. The current administration has continued that order, Just recently, they reissued it, even though that they're now opening the border up to other vaccinated travelers who are not traveling for essential purposes. So I just wanted to mention that right now, the laws are one thing, but what the administration chooses to do is a different thing. And that's, a very real issue that Anusha and myself and Stephanie and Yael have to, encounter in our day-to-day work as lawyers, where we're expected to follow the laws and our clients are. But what the US government does is another story. And there's a bunch of other policies that we're currently fighting that really specifically target that legal right to seek asylum, which has been in our laws for decades now. Sorry, Yael, I just wanted to give a little bit more context to why we might all seem a little tired and also fiery this afternoon. You asked what how I interact with this in my work. So I am a lawyer. I was barred in New York. I feel like it was just yesterday, but I guess I'm not quite as recent a grad as I like to think. And I've practiced with Human Rights First, representing asylum seekers. Largely, my practice is focused on asylum seekers in detention in New Jersey and in California, and then also asylum seekers that were subject to the Remain in Mexico policy under the previous administration. They required some asylum seekers to wait in Mexican border cities while their immigration cases in the United States were processing. So I represented people in that process as well before I shifted about a year ago to doing more about advocacy work. So as you can imagine, there's a lot to do to press this administration to live up to our laws and to our ideals of and history of providing protection to asylum seekers and refugees. Over the summer, I spent a lot of my time, and I continue to spend a lot of time focused on providing assistance to the Afghan refugees. So first through the evacuation, and then setting up a response to make sure that those who are arriving here in the US have counsel, and then holding the US government accountable for how they're treating these refugees that are arriving here. Many of them have entered without permanent status because of the speedy departure that they had to undertake from Afghanistan. So that's a huge challenge that we face. We're currently pressing Congress to pass an Afghan Adjustment Act, which would help many of them. But I will stop there and let some of my other panelists describe their work. So.
Yeah, I think that I think we're hoping to talk a little bit about Afghanistan because 3/4 of this panel has worked on Afghanistan issues over the recent months. I think that one of the exciting things about who is on this panel is that you really get a nice selection of people who do very different work at very different stages of the process. My work is on is litigation. So I sort of look at what's been happening from the direct services folks, look at what's been happening, look at what the policy folks are focusing on, and seeing if there's a way to help refugees and asylees vindicate their rights in federal court. Those rights are different depending on if you're a refugee or asylee. They're different depending on where you are. But that's sort of like what I do. And I think that like on a day-to-day basis for that means I'm doing a lot of research, a lot of writing, a lot of just like sort of collaborative thinking about strategically how we're going to do this, and a lot of like factual investigation into what is exactly happening and what are the policies that underlie what we're actually seeing happen on the border, for example. Stephanie, but your job is very different than that. So why don't you tell us a bit about it?
Sure. Yeah, so in the U.S. Legal Services Department at IRAP, where I work, the majority of the cases that we handle are direct representation or advice and counsel and information for individuals who are navigating the refugee resettlement program that we discussed earlier, as well as family reunification pathways. We have an extensive caseload of special immigrant visas for Afghans at risk. which is partly why so much of our work has also been centered on Afghanistan in the last few months, as well as other humanitarian migration pathways. I think what's unique about IRAP's legal service model is because we're focused on getting people here, the majority of our clients are located around the world. They're not already in the United States. And so our legal service work is provided remotely. We often never interact in person or see or even share a time zone with our clients during the time that we represent them. And for a variety of kind of historical reasons for the organization, we really specialize as well in populations from the Middle East and Afghanistan, although we've also recently done more work on the southern border as well. And so the day-to-day of it, I think IRAP Legal Services has developed a pretty robust infrastructure for providing remote legal assistance and really relying, pre-COVID even, really relying on modern technology and other tools to help us provide good assistance to people, who are in a different place and who we don't have the convenience of actually getting to interact with in person. I think that particularly on the refugee side of things, what's interesting is that traditionally, refugee resettlement is not seen by the government, especially as a legal process or system in which lawyers are needed or helpful. They usually conceive of it more as a humanitarian program. It's a humanitarian, it's a good thing that we do to bring people, it's helpful, it's not adversarial. And so what role would there be for lawyers in this process? But what we've experienced and what we see, I think, as individual advocates, is that individuals who are going through the refugee resettlement process are required to fit the same legal definition and criteria that Anusha mentioned earlier for asylum. You still have to meet all of those criteria. It can be legally complicated to do so. It might not be immediately obvious how your story and how your claim fits it. And you might not have the full access to the program that you would otherwise have if you don't actually have somebody who can explain that to you, who can walk you through it, who can help you draft documents, and who can push in the kind of intractable bureaucracy that is the entire system on your behalf as an individual to make sure that your case doesn't get lost, that, as one of hundreds of thousands, somebody doesn't forget to click a button. Sometimes it is as boring and simple as that, but that is actually the value add of lawyers in the system. And, because the government doesn't see this as a super legal process, and because it entirely takes place outside the United States, you have no right to counsel. And like I said earlier, there are almost no legal rights that you are actually afforded in this process. So to us, I think it indicates that there's even more value actually to having counsel, because the system will not help you necessarily. And if you don't have an easy case, or if you don't have an easy situation, you might face challenges and not actually have otherwise any access to assistance with those challenges. And a lot of times what we do, in addition to providing individual representation, is actually just providing information. And I think that's an enormous value that qualified lawyers can provide in situations where you don't have a lot of opportunity to directly advocate. We can't sit in on interviews for the most part. We're not always even allowed to write things up and submit them on behalf of individuals, but we can tell them what the government's looking for. We can tell them what this paper means that they've received that tells them that they're not, they haven't been found qualified and they only have 90 days to contest that. Many people get that paper and have no idea what it means or how they would even begin to argue against the initial denial. And that's, I think, where lawyers can come in, even in a setting where lawyers are not traditionally seen as necessary or important. And I think IRAP's really helped in a lot of ways to move the needle in that conversation in the refugee system.
Yeah, I think that's a really special thing that I've really enjoyed about working with refugees. I know that in the work that I specifically do on delays is really a result of this sort of tendency for refugee petitions to just sort of languish in whichever agency is processing it. And just filing a mandamus petition or a mandamus lawsuit in federal court could be the nudge to get a person's case, just to get it moving again. And it really shouldn't take a year of litigation. Shouldn't take filing a lawsuit to get someone's application processed. So it's certainly it's I think it's a interesting perspective to have on the work. How is that different from what you do, Anusha?
Well, I don't know if it's different per se. It's just it's a bit of a different, it's a different sphere. I think many of the things that Stephanie spoke about certainly can be transferred within the domestic aspect of things, and the feeling of constantly battling and really trying to be an advocate on the ground. I think those are the common things that Stephanie spoke about. I just wanted to elevate that the practice of immigration, whether it is through refugee work or asylum work, it is one of those platforms that truly allow you to elevate the voice of your clients, but also push for dismantling oppressive behaviors that are happening within the system. It would be wonderful if we could change the system, but because we have to accept operating within its limitation and its flaws and its biases and its prejudice, it is through the representation that we can offer that there is a little bit of that pushback, because anything that involves politically charged grounds like asylum come with a lot of personal thoughts and emotions, especially when dealing with individuals like judges or immigration officers who have discretionary power. And in that discretion can come a lot of the personal positioning. And so that's something we cannot fight unless we're fighting with the law, unless we're fighting it with legal precedent. And so I just wanted to highlight that, because it becomes, in my experience, that becomes what is giving me the reason to continue every single day and not give up, and also the reason to find joy in what it is that we're trying to do, so that there is that opportunity to really say and educate. I guess that's the word that I'm looking for, educate those involved already in an oppressive system.
Yeah, I think finding joy in our work is something that takes creative thinking. I think you have to learn how to accept when things are absolutely impossible to do and manage that, but also take joy in what we are able to do. So I think that something that we've been dancing around as we're talking about asylees and refugees is that there are refugees and asylees are not a monolith. They come from different cultures, different places. Even just being in the United States or not in the United States makes a difference. And so I think that one of the things we should really talk about is what that actually means to serve this giant population that is really a collection of population. I wonder if, Anusha, if you could sort of start us out and talk about how this plays into your work.
And specifically, you're referring to like having a variety of clients to work with? Is that what you're asking?
Well, I think that, and this is something that I know when we were preparing for this panel, we spoke about, there are so many different people who come in, and some population groups are sort of elevated. The story is out there in the news, or they receive preferential treatment from the government. You know, the visa caps are allocated by country. And what does that really mean for our clients? And what does that mean for the work that some populations get attention and get more advocacy than others? And how do we really respond to that in our work?
Yeah, that is a very loaded question, right? And it's a very, also, we all can have very different reactions to that question. I think the basis of it, and this is my personal opinion, please do not take it as if it's like the reality of the immigration world, but in my personal opinion, the work doesn't stop, right? So even when there is that sensationalization of a crisis, it is not to diminish the crisis. That's not the conversation, right? The politics behind it, it's causing this divide, the politics behind it, and it's what is letting communities believe that one issue is more important than another issue. And so on the ground, right, even outside the system, it creates a great deal of low morale that goes beyond the individual cases of of a client. And when you're already coming from having experienced trauma, whether it is through a refugee crisis or through gender-based violence or through any other form of violence, and your identity and your culture and your own crisis is being erased by something else, then there is the continuation of oppression, and there is this against telling a certain group of population that they're not valued. Like the Haitian crisis is an example. And then I leave space for my colleagues as well to share their impression and their opinions.
Robyn or Stephanie, do you want to jump in?
Sure, I'll just take from where Anusha left off with referencing the Haitians. So I'm sure people saw in the news about a month ago now, the really just shocking abuse that groups of Haitian, but also other Black migrants and asylum seekers received at the hands of Border Patrol officers mounted on horseback, wielding whip-like devices and running down largely, Black migrants. And it was just, we see the abuse by officers, particularly in CBP, all the time in this work. We see how ICE mistreats people in immigration detention, and just generally like the really awful rhetoric, in the media against asylum seekers and migrants. But to see these photos of Black migrants being run down by, white identifying officers on horseback was pretty just shocking to me and to many others. And we're a month out and there still has been no accountability. At least publicly, we haven't heard any outcomes of investigations that were promised by the president and by the Secretary of DHS. We've asked, where are those investigations? Where is the outcomes for mistreating people in such a public way when we know that this happens all the time, not in such a public way? And frankly, I think the color of people's skin is a huge part of it. There's just this really entrenched racism in our immigration system, and Black migrants in particular are disproportionately impacted by that. Much higher rates of detention and very prolonged detention for Black asylum seekers and migrants. And then just really disparate outcomes in those decisions Anusha's mentioning that are done by individual officers with very little accountability for their decision making. So it's something I see all the time in my work, something that we work closely with our colleagues at Black-led organizations like Haitian Bridge Alliance and Black Alliance for Just Immigration, who are doing incredible work, both representing individuals, but also advocating for change. But sadly, we haven't seen much action. And there's been a lot of talk about wanting to make a more humane system and to hold officers accountable for their racism or mistreatment of individuals, but very little action as yet by this administration. But it's something that we're very focused on in our representation work and wanting to expand representation for marginalized communities, but also in our advocacy. So I know that, for example, in our Los Angeles office, we just recently took on a fellow who is funded for 2 years to focus on providing and expanding access to counsel for Black asylum seekers in California. So that was really exciting to see. And it was something that was funded by the California state government in recognition of the unique needs and the disproportionate negative impact of the immigration system on Black migrants and asylum seekers. So that's great to see at a state level. We wish that there was some action taken at a federal level, which is the level where these policies are being enacted and played out. And yeah, I'll pause there.
No, I think that insight is really helpful. I think one of the things that people often don't realize about the immigration system before they get into it is all of the ways that sort of America's historic racism is not just built into like the misconduct of officers, but also into the law, into the policies that have actually been enacted. For example, there are different, there are caps for things like visas and for the number of refugees, as I said. And so in some places, for example, Mexico, the line to get a visa is very, very long because the cap is very, very low. We also see it in the refugee context, where in some consulates, processing times are much, much higher, much, much longer than in other consulates. And it happens to be Khartoum and Amman and the places that serve Black and brown folks more. And I know that we see this a lot, especially given the prior administration in Muslim majority countries as well. Stephanie, do you have more to add to that?
Yeah, I think the only thing I'll add that I was reminded of while listening to these other comments is that I think in my work, what I see, especially to combat this issue, is actually the need for really good coalition building and collaboration, and in two directions. I think one is like organizationally with other organizations, community-based groups, and I think creating some of these broader coalitions to fight against some of these issues together is really crucial, because one small group of people saying this thing that's happening is not okay isn't going to get you as far. And so I think I'm increasingly, at least from my perspective, seeing more and more of that kind of collaborative work happening. And it's very exciting and I think really necessary. And you to move the needle even a little bit on these things. And then the other thing that occurs to me is, you know, as an individual legal services provider, I can fight for this one person within the system that exists, right? So something like you just mentioned, if somebody is from a nationality that is capped in a category where they just don't have access to something, I can't actually do very much for that person individually. And that's why I think you need in this advocacy system, in addition to the direct service providers, you need people doing policy work. You need people, you know, fighting on the Hill or talking to the administration and fighting for things to happen at a policy level. You also need people to sue the government over these issues. We need impact litigation. And so increasingly, I think the more I do this work and, you know, kind of do the work in my own niche and pipeline that I happen to work in, I see how important it is actually to be working across work streams with people who are doing their advocacy from different angles, because I might be able to identify this issue and see this tension and see the problem. But if I can filter that out to people who are doing policy, litigation, communications work, to, you know, for there to be news stories, for there to be photographs, all of it has to happen together, I think, for us to actually see any movement, given how entrenched these issues are in our system, like you just said, Yael.
Yeah, I completely agree with you, not just because I work in impact litigation. I think that we couldn't do our job without you, Stephanie. Like, the Legal Services Department at IRAP is the group that flags what's wrong, and then we investigate and take it from there and try to help your clients. And I think it's really fulfilling for me personally to be able to feel like I'm also sort of helping in that direct services work. There's a lot of sort of, you know, impact litigation gets touted as sort of like a prestige type position, a high prestige role. And I really, it's not that I don't love my job, but I really think direct services are heroes, because there's just such an emotional toll to the kind of client counseling that you do. And we really couldn't do our job without you. And I think it's really important to have exposure to both direct services work and litigation, if litigation is the path that you want to go down. So I think this conversation has been really lovely. I was wondering if, I thought since Afghanistan has been in the news so much, and because some of us have been involved in the Afghanistan related work and in the evacuation, thought it might be helpful to talk a little bit about sort of what our roles were in that process and sort of what was going on behind all the news stories. So Stephanie, I know that you were on the phone with clients who were at the airport scrambling to try and get out. Can you talk a little bit about what that was like?
Sure. Cool. Yeah. So, I mean, I think for IRAP and our team, my team that I work with at IRAP, as I mentioned before, one area of our expertise that we've developed over the last decade is in this sort of special immigrant visa program that exists for Afghans who are at risk, particularly Afghans who have worked with the U.S. military or who have U.S. affiliated employment. So that's work that we've been doing for years, and that means that we have hundreds and hundreds of clients and contacts in our system that we've been counseling for the last decade on how to get out of Afghanistan. And so when things started really devolving over the summer, we obviously were very concerned about what that would mean for our clients, and activated as much of our team as possible, and so many of our resources and people really pitched in from across the organization to help with these efforts to figure out what was happening on the ground and try to help to get people out. Practically speaking, what happened was that we were not able to do very much. And what you saw on the news was what was happening in real life. And so the chaos at the airport, the confusion, many more people being attempting to get out than were able to actually get out was exactly what we were seeing. I think the difference was that unlike watching it on the news, most of the people on my team were regularly on the phone with or text messaging or emailing and talking to clients about how they were going to attempt to get out, what their options were. And for me, I think one of the most impactful parts of that experience was that it gave a particularly close-up perspective of what institutional failure looks like. Because this is a scenario where there was an obvious role for governmental agencies to be coordinating a response, and the response was incredibly inadequate, and the gap, people were attempting to fill the gap who shouldn't have been attempting to fill the gap, and that sometimes looked like lawyers, both at IRAP and volunteers and partners at Human Rights First, and friends who I know who are just trying to help out other people they knew. We're all trying to kind of figure out, in the absence of coordinated information and assistance from the government, can we help? And I'm really glad that that coordination was there. It was very encouraging to see it. It was encouraging to be a part of it, but it was also, the flip side of it was that it was very depressing because it was really like, we should not be doing this. I should not be doing this. This isn't my role in the system as a lawyer, should not be to help get somebody, past Taliban checkpoints to an airport to get evacuated. That's not what you sign up for when you go to law school. That's not what you sign up when you take on a legal job. And it was something that happened and evolved out of the role. But I think ultimately, really reinforced the perspective of, seeing up close many levels of failure on a governmental level and of betrayal for a lot of people that we actually had promised, the government had promised it would get out. And there's still, to be clear, there's a lot of work ongoing at the moment too. The US withdrew and the embassy closed, but we have hundreds of clients who are still in Afghanistan, as well as their families. So do most of our partners. There are a lot of coordination efforts trying to push for the government to not forget everyone who is left behind and just wash their hands of it, but actually fulfill their responsibilities to those folks as well. So there's a lot of ongoing advocacy, but those few weeks of really, I think, intense evacuation related work was impactful, but also incredibly difficult, I think, for everyone to experience who saw it up close.
Yeah, there was that moment when we realized that we weren't going to be able to get people out, which I think was really heartbreaking for everyone at the organization. For me, definitely, and I say that as someone who wasn't on the phone with people who were on the ground. Speaking of coordination, though, I know that Human Rights First is one of the organizations we are coordinating a lot with. So Robyn, I was wondering if you could talk about it from your perspective.
Yeah, I think I probably just second everything Stephanie mentioned. And I think I was getting a little bit twitchy listening to it again, because it was just like not something I was expecting to have a role in at all, because we have a wing of our organization, and by wing I mean 2 people who were really laser focused on the evacuation advocacy push. They are not lawyers though. And so in, I think, June or so, they reached out to me knowing that I'm a sucker and can't say no to people. And we're like, hey, we have this list of a few families that really need help to apply for US RAP. So for refugee processing, they're stuck in Kabul. We're very concerned about them. Do you think you could take these cases on? And I just, finished some other rep work that I'd been doing. And again, I'm a sucker and was like, well, I mean, why did I go to law school if not to represent people in this kind of a situation? So sure, I can, I did some very minimal thinking about what is involved in this kind of an application and was like, yeah, okay, I'll help. And then of course, the couple families turned out to be the families plus their 4 extended units of family members, because of course you're not going to just take your brother and sister or your children, you're going to take everyone that you possibly can. Anyway, and then of course, as things devolved on the ground, and I think it just happened a lot faster than a lot of us thought was coming. And we thought we had, at least weeks to try and help people get out. And that turned into days. And it's unlike anything I experienced as an attorney. I've worked with clients stuck in precarious security situations, but not when they're still in the country of origin, and not when I'm on WhatsApp trying to guide them through checkpoints and trying to and being put on the phone with the Marine who's telling them, no, we're not going to let you into the airport, and trying to, advocate to the Marine that, hey, I'm in America, I'm a lawyer, for this organization, I'm vouching for them, please let them through. That is not anything I expected to do. And, I think, yeah, and the emotional toll was pretty intense. When we realized that not everyone was going to get out, and not even close to everyone. So that was pretty devastating. But as Stephanie mentioned, the withdrawal deadline was the US government's deadline. It was not something that we agreed to. And our work to support these people and who are in Afghanistan, but also in third countries, continues. We continue to press the US government to find formal ways to get people out, people that we made promises to, the US government, who fought alongside, our troops, but also, women's rights defenders, members of civil society who built up the country on the idea of things are going to get better. We've worked with groups that are representing hundreds of women judges who are in very grave peril and hiding right now. But I think it was Stephanie who mentioned the community and coalition building. It's been really wonderful to see the sort of broad support for this effort. We've been working closely with veterans groups, with faith-based groups, with other immigrant rights organizations, but also just average, everyday lawyers at every firm that you can possibly imagine, as well as at corporations who have said, what can I do? So we're coordinating in terms of the rep that's being done here for people who've arrived, but also trying to help the many that are out of the country.
And Anusha, I think that you can speak a little bit about the rep that's been happening here, right?
Yeah, very similarly to everything that has been shared right now, the Tahrir Justice Center has created a hotline to address this side of things, right? Because we do have currently clients who are Afghan clients who have family members in Afghanistan and who can petition and have particular immigration forms filed and, seek assistance even from this side, right? And so in order to also assess legal remedies of Afghan citizens that have now entered the United States, we have created this hotline. The number is available on our website, and we have staffed it with our staff member that can really navigate the scenario, the situation, and provide at least brief advice and counsel to share and inform the potential remedy that it's available to them under American immigration law, asylum being one of them.
Thank you. So I do want to make sure we leave time for questions. So I don't know if we have any questions that have already been asked, but I think, what is the process for asking questions? Is it you message Kristen?
Yes, it is. Hi. Great discussion. Thank you so much. We do have one question in the chat box in Pathable. So folks who are on the line, if you'd like to put your questions in there under the chat tab. I have one question coming in from Benjamin Lawrence, and his question is, besides some of the obvious courses like immigration law and administrative law, what courses did you take that are now the most useful for you as advocates?
I'll go first on this, at least. Definitely administrative law. I still open my administrative law textbook every so often. Constitutional law and clinics. Really, the most useful thing I did was my clinic, because getting hands-on experience, because the actual practice of law doesn't look very much like the way you are taught in doctrinal classes. And if anyone else wants to jump in on that.
I would love to add to your list, if the law school offers it and has it, courses that teaches you the history of migration and how they're tied to colonialism. It is so important to come to this work with a great, humble posture of learning and really try to understand the cultural dynamics that are at play, so that your practice and your advocacy is not robed in a white saviorism aspect, but rather really wanting to walk the path with the immigrants. And if the law school offers such course, I think it would be important, in addition to obviously anything that outside of law school that can offer reflections on diversity, equity, inclusion, suspension of biases. I mean, these are truly hard skills that lawyers need to learn when practicing this type of immigration, and this type of practice.
Definitely. I think this also sort of returns us to the conversation we're having about people coming from different places. In order to represent someone from El Salvador, you need to understand the really specific dynamics that are happening in El Salvador. So it is very helpful to have as much information as possible and constantly be learning about what it really is, what it is that your clients are really experiencing. Robyn, Stephanie, do you have anything to add to that?
I was just going to second your mention, Yael, about clinics. I think for me, I learned to be a lawyer by watching the great mentors I had in internships and all of the experiences I had where I actually got to see people practicing. I remember being in law school and being so stressed about grades and understanding, corpse law or whatever. And it's like, I have not used that beyond my bar exam. I mean, I haven't touched that law at all. It's really like going back to watching those attorneys where I volunteered and then interned was really formative for me. And it teaches you those skills, like alongside what Anusha is mentioning, some just like practical skills as a lawyer. If you're going to go into this field, it's really important to know, how to balance work with your life, how to come at it in a way that's sustainable so that you avoid, the classics of burnout and other impacts that it can have on you emotionally and mentally. I mean, you're hearing from Stephanie and I that we had a rough summer, and I had to go back to those basics of things that I learned back in my first year of law school through interning and such. So
yeah, I think that this actually reminds me of, like you said, the conversation we were having about Afghanistan. The thing that I was thinking was, how do you handle the vicarious trauma that comes from this, like in your personal life and in whatever way that it also echoes in. A lot of people who work in this space have experienced being immigrants, and so if you could elaborate maybe on secondary trauma as a
I'm happy to jump in on that one, because I feel very strongly that lawyers in general, and then especially lawyers in this field, need access to quality mental health services. I think that it's really important for it to be destigmatized broadly, because I think it's, lots of people face challenges with their mental health. And I think it's especially prevalent in some ways in the legal field, but especially for burnout and secondary trauma reasons. I think it's super, super important that people have access to services that they need, for employers especially, to provide them. And so, if you are applying to jobs, the healthcare that's provided, that, it's something that you should look into seriously, because to stay in the field, you do need to have a certain kind of stamina. And for most people, we do not have the tools that we need necessarily to maintain that kind of stamina on our own forever. And so I personally have benefited enormously from specialized counseling for secondary trauma more than once in a pretty short career so far, because the work that we do is really intense, and it's put me in circumstances and in environments that involved a lot of pretty intense and vicariously traumatic work. And there's a lot of other things that people will say about how to combat secondary trauma that are really important, tools that you can use at home, and things that you can learn, and ways to approach your work, and really basic things about logging off when you log off, not having your phone on all night long, except in an emergency. And those things are important. And I try to practice them too sometimes. But I also just think that for most of us at some point in our lives and careers, we're going to need more than that. And so just encouraging people to take advantage of that I'm taking that opportunity now, because I think that there is still sometimes a little bit of shyness and stigma and fear and worry about what it means about you and your fitness for the profession if you need extra help. And I actually think it's the opposite. I think if you can recognize the signs that you need that help and you get it, you're going to last much longer in the career, and also just be healthier as a person, which is really important. I mean, the work that you provide to clients, especially, you have to be healthy to provide your clients with good services. And so I think prioritizing that is never a bad thing.
I could not possibly agree more with what you just said. I do want to just say one thing that I really hope law students will keep in mind, which is that you deserve to be treated well by your employers. You deserve to ask for whatever salary you need to have a living wage, and you deserve adequate healthcare. And it doesn't make you a bad lawyer, and it doesn't mean you're betraying your clients to demand it. And I think that it's something that, especially graduating and beginning work in the middle of the pandemic, a lot of I've experienced, and a lot of my peers have experienced, sort of just managing our own needs and our clients' needs, and what that actually says about us as attorneys. It looks like we have another question. So Cole Adams asked, what barriers do you see in terms of healthcare equity and access for refugees and asylum seekers? What work have you seen being done to ensure that these groups have access to healthcare? Anyone want to take this?
I can start us off. So yeah, that's a huge issue and a really good specific question. So I'll speak to asylum seekers, and maybe we can touch on what refugees are eligible for when they come in to the country. So when someone's seeking asylum, they are eligible for very few benefits, despite what some, anti-immigrant groups may put out there. It's pretty hard while you're seeking asylum. It takes a while before you become eligible for work authorization and also for any other benefits. In some states, you have access to like almost the equivalent of Medicare once you filed an asylum application, but it's not uniform across the country. And so that can be really hard when, I've had clients call me and say, X has happened and it's clear you need to go to the emergency room. But their question is, how am I possibly going to afford this? Like, I can't afford to go. And it's just heartbreaking. So what, in terms of what are we doing? We continue, in my work, we definitely advocate for greater benefits to people seeking asylum, and so touching on both work permits and healthcare options and such. As you can imagine, it's difficult in today's political climate, where immigrants are painted as taking advantage of the system and such. So it's hard, but we continue that work. And I'm curious, maybe Anusha has something to add from her experience working with people.
I wish I could add something positive, but yeah, no, similarly to what you were sharing, Robyn, we encounter the same exact challenges. And it's incredible how every time you feel like there is an opening to a possibility, such as the ones given through work permits, then it's taken away because again, it becomes a politics issue. And then I have to say that in my experience is very different state by state, right? There are some states that are extremely generous within their benefit packages, their access to benefits, you know, such as food stamps and other things, very generous states. And then there's other states where they require a much stricter eligibility. And so it really depends also where you may be located and how then the state system cooperates with the federal system, and sometimes they don't talk to one another. The driver license and Social Security, for example, is one of those areas where there's just zero communication. And so again, you find yourself to have to go against a system that does not understand what immigrants are entitled to in this country, and they think that they have limitations when they don't. And so then you're also partnering with your social services colleagues and other advocates to just push the envelope even more.
No, definitely. Stephanie, do you have anything to add on that for the refugee side?
I mean, I think for refugees, when they arrive in the United States, have some limited access to assistance that's set aside for them in coordination with the federal government and NGOs that are contracted to provide resettlement assistance. It's very limited. And at the end of the day, once they're here like everybody else. And so they face, you know, very similar barriers upon arrival. And yeah, I think the only other broader thing to keep in mind as well is that many of these folks, especially refugees who arrive through resettlement, spend a lot of time somewhere else between their home country and the US for the most part, where they often do not have lawful status and also have very limited access to healthcare and medical services. So there's a global component to this problem as well that can follow them through their migration pathway, you know, and can follow them for years and result in serious health repercussions down the line, even after arrival, because of access to limited services throughout that journey that they've had. And so there's kind of a zoomed out big picture, it's a problem everywhere answer, I think.
Yeah, and I think the only thing that I will add to all of this is just a brief Equal Justice Works plug that I think they would want me to say, which is that Equal Justice Works actually funds like medical legal partnerships. So if the interaction between law and medicine is something you're interested in, that's something to sort of pay attention to and keep in mind. So that looks like that's all the time we have. So I'm gonna pass it back to Kristen to close us out.
Great. Well, your plug noted. Thank you. Well, Anusha, Robyn, Stephanie, and Yael, this has been such a great panel. And first of all, thank you for doing such critically important work. We truly appreciate you sharing your practice knowledge and your individual and collective wisdom and advice with us today. It really means a lot. And we hope the participants on the line and you all enjoyed this time together. The recording of the session will be available for all of you to listen to later today, and you can access it at any time by coming back to this page on Pathable. I also just want to take a brief moment to thank our conference sponsor, which is Idealist. And so they've really made our conference this year possible. And right after this session, we will be holding a session with the Director of Business Development at Idealist to talk a little bit more about how you can find your dream public interest job. And we hope folks will join us there. And if you have any questions about the conference and career fair, or how we can help as Equal Justice Works to launch your public interest career, please come speak to one of us. We are available today and tomorrow from 12 to 6 p.m. Eastern time today, and you can search for that session by going to Equal Justice Works under the Organizations tab in Pathable. So we hope you had a great session today and enjoy the rest of the conference. Have a great day, everyone, and thank you. Bye.